Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the April 2021 Leader Transition Institute training and coaching session. We are a 501c3 organization that walks beside and prepares people to make pivots in their lives, big or small. And we help them to get from where they are to bridge that gap from where they are to where they want to be. Our flagship program is called Changing Focus, Moving from We to Me, and it is designed for service members who are transitioning from active duty to the civilian sector, and for veterans from any era who decide they want to reset their transition. And to provide them ongoing continuing education, we do these monthly training and coaching sessions. Tonight, we are so fortunate because we have Chris Smith with us. He is a financial advisor with Edward Jones, and he proudly served in the Army as an infantry officer before he did that. I was talking to him earlier. I've known Chris for a few months now and was just talking to him earlier tonight. And I said, hey, Chris, is this something that you picked up after you left the military? And he said, no, actually, he had started in personal finance before he joined the military while he was still in college. So this is a culmination of something he started when he was younger. Chris served in the Army for several years. He's married and has a wife and two children. They live in, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's Wisconsin. Did I get it right?
Nailed it.
All right. Yay.
I call it Southern Canada too. So whatever you want to say.
Okay. And I will tell you, in the past, you haven't seen us bring on advisors from any financial firms, and that's because I feel very firmly that we want to provide to you expertise from financial experts who have nothing to gain from what they tell you. And that's why Chris is with us tonight. He is with Edward Jones. He's not on commission. He is a salaried employee, and he is going to talk to us tonight about what to do with our 401ks when we move from one organization to another. So thank you so much, Chris, for spending some time with us tonight. You let me know when it's time to bring your PowerPoint up on the screen, and we will do that.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Annie. And I do, like Annie said, I'm a veteran, so I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk to other veterans or folks transitioning from the service, because I have been in those shoes before, and I do know how stressful it can be, whenever you're transitioning, like Annie said, to a new position, a new company. If you're having to move or leaving the service and starting a new career, everything's like a whirlwind. And one of the things that we don't want to lose too much sight on is our long-term goals, our retirement plans, and those types of things. But, it's easy to kind of push to the side because it is, for some of us, still away in the distance. So that's why I do enjoy this session and reviewing these options with folks, because it can apply to TSP, 401k, 403b, a lot of those different retirement plans. So what we want to do is, I like things to be pretty interactive, and no one wants to sit and hear me just talk for 15 minutes straight. So I won't subject you to that. But what we will do is, I'll give a high-level overview, and then when we go through each section, we'll pause. Annie's going to keep track of questions, and then if you do have questions, please bring them up. If they're extremely specific, then you can always reach out to me offline. But if it's general or just something that we're talking about, please by all means type it up or let us know. So.
And I put a note, just so you know, I put a note in the chat telling them if they had any questions or comments as we go along, to make sure they put them there, and we will make sure to answer them.
Perfect. That's perfect. Okay, so you can go ahead and pull up the slideshow whenever you're ready, Annie.
Okay, there we go.
All right, perfect. So I just want to make sure I have control of this. So, okay. So let me go back here real quick. Excuse me. So, like we talked about, so there will be four options that we have to look at when we are, with different transitions of our life. We're going to get through that. But this slide here, what I tell people is just, whether it be retirement or this section of your life, Whatever the goal is, make sure when we're still thinking about it, when you're wanting to, when you're making those transitions, definitely think of what your goal looks like. Just like with anything else in life for what we're trying to accomplish. So the more detailed and specific you can be will help you kind of plan and put the right processes in place to make sure that we're successful with it, right? So I just always, even though we're talking very technical here, I think it's always good to have that why and what that goal is on what you're trying to achieve kind of in your back pocket. So like Annie said, and I talked about earlier, so we have a few different, this can apply in a few different areas, right? If you're changing employers, whether it be from manufacturing to another manufacturing, leaving the service, going to the civilian world, being laid off, but not ready to retire. We had a lot of that with COVID over the past year and the pandemic. Being offered an early retirement or being ready to retire for good, right? So there's a lot of different ways in which the areas and the topics that we'll cover tonight can apply. So just again, keep those things in mind. So as we talk about the 4 options, right? Again, we'll keep it pretty specific, but high level right now. So the first one is you may be able to just leave your retirement assets where they're at in the plan they're at. The second one is you might be able to move it over into your new employer's plan. Okay. The third one is you can roll it over or your plan assets into what's called individual retirement account, or an IRA for short. And then lastly, you can receive a lump sum distribution, right? So basically cashing it and taking it. So before I hop into the actual potential benefits and some of those things and trade-offs, are there any specific questions so far?
No, there are no questions yet.
Okay, perfect. Well, you can just stop me if there are. So
okay.
Alrighty, and when we talk about those things, so I like to look at it from on each topic, and we'll go into detail here, but the benefits and the trade-offs of all 4 of these, right? So, and really, think about it generally. So in each one of these, we'll look at, what the investment options are. So, what choices you have, what account options there are, advice and guidance. So in each of these, do you have access to someone that can help you plan, help you, kind of put those goals together that I talked about, fees and expenses, right? So each one of these are going to be different in the different fees that they involve or less. Each one of them is slightly different there. And then taxes and penalties. No one wants to pay more taxes, generally what I found. So I'm just understanding in each of these, right, what that looks like. In general, there's a 10% early withdrawal penalty, and income taxes can apply if you take the money out prior to age 59 and a half, unless there are certain conditions or circumstances that apply. So we'll dig more into that. But again, that's something to keep in mind as we look at these 4 different options. And then withdrawal options and required minimum distributions, or RMDs is what I'll refer to them. So just understanding here, how much access you'll have to the money that when you need it. And then your assets, when those required minimum distributions, if they're required and how they're required, right? Because it's different with all of these as well. And then lastly, if there are any other considerations. So if your current employer or your last employer offered stock options, and then other things to consider, like do you have retirement assets? Are they protected by creditors, and things like that? So with that said, if there are no questions so far, I'll just jump into the first one.
Okay.
All right. So let's talk about the first one, which is the leave it option. So not always the case, but in most cases, your previous employer will allow you or your plan administrator to just leave your assets where they're at, right? So it's always good to just check with that plan administrator as you're transitioning out to see what those options are and what they look like. But generally that is an option, right? So some of the benefits here are going to be, avoiding potential taxes and penalties, right? Because you're not taking a distribution, you're just leaving it where it's at. And then your savings and your investments will continue to grow tax deferred, right? So as with anything else, if you're not paying taxes or having to pay those capital gains taxes, they will grow even more and compound over time. So again, it's a good benefit of just leaving it where it's at. And then also, it may result in lower fees and expenses relative to those of an IRA, because again, it's not being administered, right? You're not having it be managed. It's just kind of sitting there. And then also one key thing to note is if you leave your employer in the calendar year that you turn 55 or after 55, typically what you can do is actually take your money from your employer without that 10% early penalty withdrawal before 59 and a half. So if you need to access your retirement plan assets before you turn 59 and a half, you may want to consider this option for at least a portion of your assets rather than rolling all of your assets into an IRA, which would then have that penalty. And then your employer will generally be required to withhold 20% of the distribution for federal tax purposes. So take that into consideration and determine how much of your assets to leave in your current former employer's plan, I should say. And then also assets held in employer plans offer a different level of creditor protection than those held in an IRA. That's something that's kind of beyond the scope of this conversation. But if you do have questions on that, you can reach out to an attorney or tax professional kind of on more insight into that. Any questions on the benefits there?
No, but you know what I put in the chat that I think one of the keys to doing this, if you're going to leave it somewhere, is not to forget that you've done that.
Yes.
Because sometimes we don't always keep good track of our finances, and that's why they publish in the newspaper the found money lists or the lost money lists. People forget that they have accounts places, so I think it's really important that people remember if they've left an account someplace.
Yes, and that's a very good point, Annie. And I actually just ran into that last week, because it is very easy to, or like, for instance, my wife and I are doing estate planning right now because we haven't done a will before and some of those things. So at any rate, we're gathering up all this information and all these assets and all these things to get over to the lawyer. And it's, there's so many different things. So the more you can have consolidated, the more that you don't have. It's like you said, it's easy to forget if you kind of don't have it all in one spot or, a couple different spots. Because I just actually had a client last week that, had something sitting in an old employer's account, and then it got moved to a cash account in a holding company. And so it really wasn't earning any money for him over the last couple of years. So that can happen. And that's a good segue into, right, what are the potential trade-offs for leaving your assets in your former employer's plan? So
okay, we just had a question. It says, I put it up on the screen.
Okay.
I have 2 different 401k plans I left with previous employers. I was thinking it would be better to combine them all.
Sure. And it definitely can be. And that's what I'll kind of hit on as we continue to go. One thing, and kind of, as you can probably imagine, with everyone's in a unique situation, right? Okay. I've had some people that have 2 or 3 old 401ks and one maybe a very small amount, and they may have some debt that they want to pay off, and they may have a larger one that they want to either roll over or put into their current 401k. So I would say it definitely could make sense to combine them all into your current 401k or roll it over. It really just depends on the specific situation for everyone, right? So I would say, I guess, is there a more specific question with that? Or did that?
No, she just was thinking that it would be better to have the 2 small accounts rolled into one so that it would be one bigger account.
Sure.
Probably easier for management purposes.
Definitely easier from, like we talked about, consolidation purpose, right? And knowing where everything's in one spot. And I'll kind of get into it here in a minute, but by, if you are able to move it into your new employer's 401k, then again, you know where it's at, but you're also able to make contributions to it. So sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, and Margie, I wanted to know, and then we'll let you go on and then ask you about another one
Sure.
after. If it's got a larger account, if you have a larger size account, would you generally have an opportunity maybe to get better interest to earn a better rate of return on it?
As opposed to if it's a smaller.
As opposed to the two smaller accounts?
Yeah, I mean, if it's combined into a larger sum and especially if you're continually reinvesting in it, right, or adding to it each month, it's just going to compound a lot faster and grow better. Yep. So very good question. Did that answer your question?
So go on, and then we'll tackle the next question in a little bit here.
Okay, sure. And some of those questions, they are great questions, and it kind of is a good segue. So what we talked about too, and kind of jumping ahead here, but generally one of the drawbacks again to leaving it is you can't contribute to your former employer's plan once you leave your employer, right? So continuing to contribute to it, you can't do that anymore. So it's just like what we were talking about, is you can take it, put it into your new, I'm sorry, am I not on the, yeah, I'm on it. Okay. So you can bring it into your new employer and be able to do those things. Also, right, number of limited investment options. So you're really kind of bound to whatever the plan administrator, whatever the financial institution is there, and what investments that they have in that plan, right? So if there were specific things that you wanted to invest in or look at different types of investments, leaving it in that plan, it may be kind of limited there, as compared to like an IRA or maybe what your new 401k provider at your new employer is offering, right? So it's definitely good to understand what those different options are when you're looking at different investments and understanding that. And then the other one, kind of a withdrawal or a drawback too, is just understanding, what those things are, what the best or best performing investments, or what's the right strategy to take based on what your goals are, what your risk tolerance is. Generally speaking, these plans will have educational material and maybe some tools or a phone number to call, but generally won't have someone to kind of coach or ask questions to and kind of look at that strategically with, right? Because it's a self-directed plan. All righty. Let me jump over here. So before we jump into the move it, any other questions specifically just about leaving it where it's at?
There's one question about a Roth IRA, but I think it more applies to to the move it side of things, but I'm not sure. Okay. I'm not the pro.
Cool. No, that's fine. And we're actually going to hit on the Roth IRA here shortly, and we'll talk through that. So if you're okay with that, we'll table that for just a minute. And then for whoever had that question, if it's still not answered after we kind of hit that, then please by all means just ask.
Okay.
Specifically. So okay. Excuse me. So second option is moving it, right? So if you are changing employers or again transitioning from the military, your new employer probably offers some sort of a plan that you can roll it into, or should say move it to. And a lot of those benefits are going to be very similar to the leaving it. So I'm not just going to repeat myself on what those were, but what I will go into more detail on is the additional benefits by moving it over into your new employer's plan, aside from just leaving it. So one of it is what we kind of have already touched on, is the benefit of consolidating your old holdings with your new holdings, especially if your new employer does matching, right? again, that's free money that your employer's helping give you towards your retirement. So having those combined and continuing to invest and compound is a very nice thing to have. And then also, again, having everything kind of more consolidated into one spot is nice because you're not trying to, again, it's easy to forget about these things. And I've had several clients that have had something sitting there for 3 or 4 or more years that they just weren't sure or haven't done something with. So by just moving it kind of right away, if your new employer allows for that, is a very nice thing to do. And then also another added benefit is that if you plan to work past the age where you have to start taking a required minimum distribution, you generally do not have to take it when it's in your current employer's plan. So essentially, and it may not be.
So that's a good reason not to leave it someplace.
Yes.
So what you're saying then is that if you've left it someplace, then you have to take those RMDs when you turn 59 and a half.
So maybe I misspoke. So the RMDs generally won't take in effect until a certain age, and it's 70 and a half.
Oh, okay. Maybe I misunderstood.
No, it's okay. It's good to clarify. So if you're born before 1944, after, then it's 72. So many people may not be planning on working at that point, but if you do, or someone is, then if you're still, have your assets in that new employer's plan, you won't be required to start taking those minimum distributions. So
okay.
Does that clear things up?
Yes.
Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the IRA section, because in a traditional IRA, you do have to start taking those. So let's jump ahead in the move it section to the trade-offs. So essentially, they're very, very similar to the trade-offs that you would have if you just left it at your old employer, right? So less individual control, the potentially limited investment options, right? Because again, it's really whatever the plan administrator chooses for that plan. And then again, potentially limited access to a financial advisor, someone to help kind of strategically look and coach on what those best options might be holistically. All right. Okay. So it sounded like we had a couple questions potentially on IRAs. So this will be a good segue. Before we get to that though, any questions on the moving it to a new employer?
None that I can see.
Okay. We'll keep trucking along here. So I'm not sure if anyone is able to communicate through talking like this, but if you want to type this in when I'm about to answer or ask this question, please, by all means, I'd love to have some participation or someone kind of talk through it or try and explain it. But again, so before we get to the roll it section, what is a individual retirement account, right? So an individual retirement account is very similar, especially traditional one, to your employer plan, and that it will grow and save tax deferred. So what that means is you're not paying taxes on any capital gains while you're accumulating that wealth. It's all being deferred until you start taking those withdrawals later in life.
And the whole idea of that is that when you take those withdrawals, you'll be in a lower tax bracket, right? That's the whole point.
Yes, but yes, generally speaking.
Generally speaking.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. And you're really good at segueing, Annie. So you can have an IRA in addition to your plan at work too. I know that's a question people ask sometimes. So it was mentioned earlier and asked about a Roth, I believe. So there are two types of IRAs, a Roth and a traditional. Does anyone want to take a stab at what the major differences are?
So put in the chat for us what you think the differences are between a Roth IRA and a traditional IRA. We'll just give them a couple minutes.
Sure. Allow me to grab some water real quick too.
Okay.
Perfect. right. Let's see what we got here.
So Margie says with a Roth, you pay taxes now.
Okay. That's true.
And with an IRA, it's with a regular IRA that it's tax deferred.
Yes. She's on to it. she's on definitely
Okay.
on the right track there.
And Dixie says the difference between the two is the tax rate.
Okay. Any other thoughts or input?
Got some quiet ones out there tonight.
Yeah.
Thanks, Margie and Dixie, for chiming in.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So, yeah, that's a really good. It's pretty well on it. So, I would like to use the analogy. My wife is grew up on a farm in Iowa, so I like to, and I'm a former infantry guy, so I like to keep things simple. So essentially, the way I like to make it just make total sense is think of it as if you're a farmer, right? You can eat and you're planting your crops. So you can either pay taxes on the seeds and all the material when you first purchase it. And then when you take your crops to harvest, you're not paying tax on any of the yield, anything that it produces, right? So that's kind of like a Roth IRA. So was it Margie? So she kind of nailed that one with you
Yep.
do pay taxes on the contributions that you make up front. But then as it grows tax deferred. And then when you withdraw it, as long as you're not taking it out before 59 and a half, you're not having to pay taxes on any of that growth. So it grows, the Roth will grow tax-free. And then when you withdraw it, it is tax-free.
Okay, so Val Speltz also put in that there's a difference in how much money you can put into the account. Is there a difference between a traditional and a Roth about how much money you can contribute on a yearly basis?
So on that, it's the same. So it's $6,000 if you are 50 or younger for either traditional or Roth. If you're older than that, the IRS does allow for a catch-up period, so an additional $1,000. So you can do $7,000 a year in either account. But there is a limit into if someone were to have two. Like I have a Roth and I have a traditional from when I roll over my old 401k. So I can only contribute to $6,000 between the two for the year. So if that makes sense. So
okay. So it doesn't matter that it's the same amount to each kind.
Yep. And total. Yep. You can have a spouse though. If you're married, you can have a Roth and your spouse can have a Roth or a traditional, and then that basically doubles. So instead of 6, you can do 12, 6 and 6 apiece. So sorry, not to go down a rabbit hole there, but good. Yeah, very good questions, very good conversation. And then so going back to the farming analogy, so for a traditional IRA, and it's very similar to like 401k in this regard of it is, someone mentioned it grows tax deferred, right? So essentially just the opposite of the earlier farmer analogy. So I'm not paying any taxes on my wheat, my seeds, anything I need to plant my crops. So all that, I never pay taxes on it as I purchase it, as I put it in, utilize the equipment to do it. And then when I take it to harvest, I am paying taxes on pretty much everything that I earn at that time. So again, with the traditional IRA, both of those grow tax deferred. The Roth grows tax free. And then the traditional, you do pay taxes on it once you take it out. The other thing to keep in mind that a lot of people tend to forget, and it's easy to, is that because, again, as I think Marjorie mentioned, is that Roth money, the contributions, you are taxed when you put it in, right? It's after-tax dollars. So if you can withdraw the contribution portion before 59 and a half and not have to pay taxes on it because you've already been taxed on it once, and the IRS is not going to double tax you on that. So
interesting.
Yeah. So it's a nuance that, it's easy to kind of forget about that portion. So again, not that it's always the best option to do that. But again, if almost like a backup emergency fund, if you absolutely had to, right, you could access that money and not have to pay taxes on the contribution or principal portion. So
perfect.
Any other questions on those? So we're going to focus today mainly in this topic on the traditional IRA,
Okay.
because of that exact reason of, as we're the 401k and most work plans that we do are taxed in a similar fashion. So generally when people do a rollover to an individual retirement account or an IRA, because the traditional IRA is taxed very similarly, it generally makes the most sense to roll it into that rather than put it into a Roth and pay those taxes that year, right? So we will focus on that right now.
Yeah, that could be a chunk, huh? If you rolled it over and had to pay the taxes on it, depending on how much you had.
Yep, it could be. And like we talked about earlier, sometimes it does make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have someone that just had like $5,000 in and he didn't pay very much. He generally gets a refund. So he was wanting to, hey, I'd rather do that now, pay a little bit of taxes on it, than have it grow more tax-free over time. But you're right. If it's, $100,000 or something more than that, then it may not make the most sense. So again, it's good to look at all those different options when trying to make the best decision. And what we talked about earlier, again, one thing I wanted to hit on with the traditional IRA. So again, we talked about that, you can take the distribution at any time, but you will have to pay a 10% penalty if you're under the age of 59 and a half when that distribution occurs. There are some exceptions to the penalty, such as, a disability, or sometimes using the funds for higher education expenses. There's some other things that the IRS allows for, but certain requirements must be met in order to qualify for those. And that's something you can always check into if you have a specific question on that. And then like we talked about and you alluded to a few minutes ago, Annie, so beginning age 72, or 70 and a half if you're born before 1949. Not going to ask anyone when they were born, but just kind of know those dates and know those times.
I think we're all, probably most of us watching on it. I know those of us on this and probably most of us watching it are in the later group. So I'll claim youth for all of us.
Okay, that's perfect. I was going to say I would assume that, but we all know what assuming does. So I just like to throw that out there just in case. But if that does, obviously apply to you, if you have specific questions on that. But yeah, so in a traditional IRA, you do have those required minimum distributions once you hit that age. So, all right. And then, like I said, we already kind of hit on what the main differences are in a traditional IRA, right? And then same thing with the Roth. We kind of already went into quite a bit of detail on those. So any questions more specifically on those two different types before we go into that? Okay, perfect. All right, so let's actually go into the rolling it portion then, right? And what that kind of process looks like, what those benefits or, again, trade-offs can be. So one of the bigger ones is individual control, right? So as we talked about, the name implies it is an individual retirement account. So it does allow greater control over what's in it, what investments you have in there, right? If there's specific mutual funds or stocks or exchange traded funds, ETFs, people can put annuities in it if they want, individual bonds, bond funds. So there's generally a lot broader selection of investments that you can put in there or invest in it. That's not adhered to by the plan administrator based on whatever plan they choose. And then also because it it is a self-direct, or it is an individual retirement plan and not self-directed, you are able to generally work with an advisor, work with someone that can help coach you on again, defining your goal, figuring out what those strategies are, what your risk tolerance is, and really strategically putting a plan together and working through that. And then lastly, so kind of similar to moving it to your new employer, you can consolidate by having an IRA if you have other types of accounts, like a non-qualified account or kids education, right? Again, having kind of all of those, a traditional IRA, Roth IRA, whatever those are, kind of having those with one advisor or one firm. Again, it kind of helps for tax purposes, filing at the end of the year, kind of having everything consolidated is, again, an added benefit rather than having things in different places.
Okay, great. So, Chris, we do have one question.
Sure.
What's the difference between tax-free growth and tax-deferred growth?
Yep. So really, really good question. And
she wanted to know, is there less taxes paid on one over the other?
Yes.
I think that's a could be.
It could, yeah, it is a could be. It's very much a could be. So think of with the Roth and the traditional IRA or 401k, right? It's all tax deferred because you're not having to pay taxes on it at that time as it's growing. The difference is, again, in a 401k or a traditional IRA, once you do start withdrawing, because you've never paid taxes on those, right? You didn't pay taxes when you contributed it because it's pre-tax income, or you didn't pay taxes on it as it growed. When you take it out, you do have to pay taxes on it, right?
So, okay, so clarify for me. I just had this. I think about these things.
Sure.
So, are you then? What you're telling me is you're paying taxes just on the income that you've made, or you're paying taxes on the actual money that you put into the account because you didn't pay taxes on that money when you put it into the account?
Yep. So good question. So for a traditional IRA and a 401k, right, and anything that you put into with pre-tax dollars, you're paying taxes on all of it, right? So thinking back to that farming analogy, right? You're not paying taxes anything up front or as you're using it or as you're, doing your crops. But once you sell it to market and you're actually earning, take it in, you're actually paying taxes on everything. So that the difference between
Gotcha.
tax deferred and tax free. So with the Roth, again, it's growing tax deferred, and you're not paying taxes on it. But again, if you take it out after 59 and a half, that's growing tax free. So those earnings, you're never, as long as it's, again, you're not touching the earnings before 59 and a half, that grows tax free. Even when you withdraw it, you do not have to pay taxes on it. Hopefully that cleared that question up. Okay. If not, please just let us know.
Margie, if Chris answered that question, put yes in the chat. And if you need some more explanation, let us know, please. Thank you.
Yep. More than happy to go more. So
perfect.
All right. So let's get into the potential trade-offs of rolling it over. So generally, IRAs do have higher fees and expenses than an employer plan, right? Than an administrative plan through your employer. They could include the actual individual retirement account fee. Sometimes there's a fee just for having an individual retirement account and the administrative piece, that goes along with that. And then also, sometimes there's investment-related fees, depending on the types of investments that are in there, if it's mutual funds or stocks. So it really just, again, depends on the specific situation. And then understanding what the plan administrator fees are for moving it, you can kind of allow you to see, weigh those different options. And then again, you will, for the traditional IRA, you will have to take those required minimum distributions at the age of 72. But in your current employer's plan, if you are working that long and you're there, you can delay those RMDs until you actually leave your employer. So a little bit of a difference there. And then lastly, assets that are held in an employer plan, and those held in IRAs may have different levels of protection from creditors under law. So again, kind of outside the bounds and scope of this conversation. But if you have questions on that, please, by all means, you can reach out. And then if you do decide for rolling it over into an IRA, there's really two ways to do it. Let me scroll over here. So it's what's called direct or an indirect. And basically it just depends really on how the former plan administrator basically writes the check or makes it payable to, and how that process goes. So I want to make sure that this is pretty straightforward, but it can get a little confusing. So I want to make sure it answers these questions. So with what's called a direct rollover here on this left side, so when you roll it over into an IRA, so the check is made payable with a direct rollover to the IRA trustee or the custodian. So if it's, let's just say if,
so basically, can I just ask a question because of how we address it in our Changing Focus program? When you're talking about a direct rollover, you're talking about institution to institution, right?
Yep, exactly. Okay. Yep. So let's say, if you have accounts at Bank of America or Edward Jones or wherever it is, right, that's not at your new employer. So you're essentially, obviously with your authorization and calling together and signing the necessary paperwork, but then you're essentially instructing your former institution or employer administrator, plan administrator, to move it. So like, let's say Fidelity to Edward Jones, or, Fidelity or something else to Bank of America, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Essentially, they will make the check, to Edward Jones, FBO, Marjorie Stewart, right? Mm-hmm. Or whoever that is. And then, so the benefit of doing that is you're avoiding that 20% withholding in taxes and penalties, because you're not taking any possession of it, right? It's just going straight from your former plan into an individual retirement account. So it's not going to the person; it's just going straight into that without exchanging, going into your hands.
Right.
And then the indirect rollover. So if your distribution check is going, instead of going institution to institution, it's going institution to person. If it's made payable to you, you can still roll it over into a traditional IRA, but you do lose some of those benefits again because you're taking it out of that employer plan. The employer must withhold 20% of the distribution, and then if you do not do anything with it within those 60 days that the IRS allows for, there can be a 10% penalty, and we'll kind of get more into that when we talk about the taking it portion is the fourth option.
Okay. We always, in Changing Focus, we always just put stomp and say, do an institution to institution rollover, because that keeps you out of trouble.
Sure. That's very much the easiest, generally speaking.
Because, you have those 60 days, but, stuff happens. And so you can say, oh, I'm going to do this. And have the check written to you and say, I can get it all done within the time period so that I don't owe any fees and anything because I want to be in control. But you know what? Life just gets in the way. So we just really foot stomp that to people. Just do the institution thing. Just, you kind of have to get over yourself, because if you don't,
Right.
Well, it's not worth that money.
No, it's not. And it's really just easier way to do it. And you just, you have your plan, you make the call, sign the cert paperwork to get it done, and, it's done. To your point, Annie, you don't have to worry about it. You can focus on, again, transition into your new role. If you're moving, yeah, it's easy to 60 days can definitely creep up on you very quickly. So
Yep.
without potentially avoid some of that, it's definitely the easiest way to not have to worry about that. So, okay, so let's talk about the take it option. So I know it can sound extremely tempting. And like I said earlier, in some cases it can make sense depending on the amount or the specific situation for the person. But definitely just think about, right, how tempting sometimes it can be, to have that lump sum of, I could pay off this bill or pay off this debt or buy this boat I always wanted, or my Corvette that I've wanted since I was 17 or whatever it may be, or vacation home. But really, like I talked about earlier, understanding your why, knowing what those long-term goals are, really think about the longevity of that money, because it's something that you've been putting away and working towards for probably a while. And also thinking about just how long, with medical advances, your parents have lived, your grandparents may have lived, uncles, siblings, relatives. So, right, if you're, and I say relatively young, if someone is 65 today, they probably could easily plan on living another 20 or 30 years. So we want to make sure that money, again, that you've worked so hard to accumulate, that it's going to last when you're, in your 80s, in your 90s. So you're not, having to rely on family members or, getting a job that you don't want to have to get later on in life. So really, it's easy to think about what those things could be that we want to spend our money on, but then that's where kind of looking holistically long-term, making sure you have a plan, knowing what you need, knowing what your expenses are going to need to be is really, really helpful. Also, taxes can be a big part of this decision. So like we talked about a few minutes ago, if you do choose to take that distribution, your employer is required to withhold 20%, generally speaking. I mean, there's generally, can be an exception for some things, but generally speaking, we'll withhold at least 20% for federal income taxes. And then you'll be required to pay that income taxes on the distribution year that you took it. And then also, like we talked about earlier, if you're before 59 and a half, you will also generally have to pay that 10% penalty, again, unless there are specific exceptions that the IRS allows for. Sorry, go ahead.
That's a third of your money.
Yeah. So I have
you gotta have a really good reason.
Yeah. So I think this really, kind of shows it. A couple different scenarios here. Again, they're pretty straightforward, but I think it really, like you said, it really brings it home. So if you're 59 and a half and with the retirement plan balances, say you have $100,000 and you're in the 24% tax bracket, so you'll owe $24,000 with that lump sum distribution if it's directly paid to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a big portion just right off the bat of money that you've been investing and saving for the majority of your life. And then, so here's another example, right? So if you're younger than 59 and a half, again, you may have to pay that 10% penalty. So that would leave you with, $66,000 of that $100,000 after the taxes and the penalty. So like you mentioned, a third of that, I know most people generally don't want to pay the government more money than what they already have to. So I think that really shows good numbers and good example of why taking it, if you can avoid it, can be such a big impact. So again, you've been working so hard and so many years to accumulate that money and accumulate that wealth. It's really best to take advantage of those tax advantages that you've been doing all those years. So any questions on that so far?
Nope.
Okay. And this just shows, again, right, kind of the difference of having it in one of those tax deferred accounts rather than having it, your money being taxed, taxable over the years, right? Pretty big impact by having that tax deferral. One of the other things I want to cover, I'll be pretty brief about this because I think it may not happen very often, but it's still good to just cover, is if you have, some employer stock from whatever employer you're moving to, or from, I should say. So if you do have employer stock or other securities in your former employer's plan, so you might be able to receive special tax treatment. That's actually referred to as a net unrealized appreciation. I'm just going to refer to it as NUA. So with this strategy, you pay income taxes on the amount that you originally paid for the employer stock when you actually distribute it from the plan. So the taxes on any increase in the value of the employer stock from the original purchase price aren't due until you actually sell the stock, and it's taxed as long-term capital gains. So the way that this can actually be advantageous is if you have a large position in the stock or the security that they have, or the employer stock has increased significantly in value from the original purchase price. So let's say if you worked at, actually have a client that had this happen. So worked at Tesla, right? And, 1 year and then a year later, it's worth a lot more. Right. Tesla's a great example of that. So there's plenty of different examples. So your income tax rate is higher than your long-term capital gains tax rate. Another one would be if you intend to hold the security for over the long term, then potentially leave it to your heirs too. So kind of some different scenarios there. And again, obviously, like I said earlier, if there are specific questions that someone has, they can always reach out. That can be kind of a complex topic for right now, but by all means, we can cover that in more detail. And then also, it's becoming less common, but still have run into this sometimes, that some employers, right, they have pensions and essentially have a option between a lump sum or an annuity type of payment. Just some things to keep in mind with that too. Once you get to that point, a monthly pension. So it's a great concept because it can basically provide a lifetime of income for you and your spouse, potentially. It's predictable. So, you're essentially knowing how much you're going to get each month to use in retirement. It can be a couple problems if the pension doesn't generally, I've seen a couple, but it's not very common that it can adjust for inflation, but generally does not adjust for inflation. And then also, generally, it may not carry over to a spouse or heirs. So not kind of planning that out that way, but can be a good benefit for, obviously just monthly steady income, right? Regardless of what the markets are doing, I'm getting this payout every month, essentially. So any questions on that so far?
Nope.
Okay. Well, I know that was kind of a lot of information in a short amount of time. So I'll just do a very high level summary. So again, what we talked about. So first strategy of leaving it, you can leave it right where it's at. You can move it if you're moving to a new employer and not retiring, right? You can move it straight into your, generally speaking, you can move it into your new employer's plan. Third one is you can roll it over into a IRA. And then obviously the last one, again, you can take that lump sum distribution, just hopefully understanding now the kind of consequences or what would entail. So whatever those are, though, again, all of these can make sense in specific situations. So if you have any questions on specific situations, I always say it's best to consult with an advisor if you have one, a tax person, a CPA if you have one. And if not, again, you can by all means reach out to me for any questions.
Yeah, let me put your email address up so that they have it. If you want to reach out to Chris, go ahead. There's his email address at the bottom. So you can do that. And then if anybody has any other questions, we're going to hang out here for just a little bit to make sure we answer your questions. And I think one of the things, one of the important takeaways about this, Chris, is that what it makes sense to do at one time in your life might not make sense to do it that same way the next time. So it might make sense one time to leave an account somewhere, and then at another time to move it or to roll it. And am I getting that right?
No, definitely. That's what I always say is everyone is in a different spot in life. Everyone has different goals. Everyone has different things. And even just within, like you said, Annie, even an individual person, things change, right? What 22-year-old Chris Smith thought about things is not what 36-year-old Chris Smith thinks about things and what is important to me now. So yeah, it's different times in life. Each one of these could potentially be appropriate, or even like someone had asked about if you have a couple small ones, sometimes, like I said, it may make sense to put it into your new employer, or it could make sense to roll it over to an IRA. And then with the other small one, maybe there's a high credit card debt that it makes sense to take that little bit of a tax hit on a small amount of money and then pay off that high interest rate. So again, it's different. I've almost never seen it be the exact same best case scenario for the same person.
That makes sense. And hey, everybody, I put Chris's email address in the chat just to make it easy for you so you can copy and paste it out. So awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate you spending this time with us. We are going to leave this video up for about 48 hours, wherever you're seeing it, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook, on the LTI Facebook or the LTI YouTube. Then we're going to put it into our vault. And so I really want to say thank you so much. I do want to here, let me do my tech wizardry here. So let me put up our Leader Transition Institute website and let you know that we are in the process of closing out registration for the May session of Changing Focus, Moving from We to Me. You can get there directly at the Leader Transition Institute website, or if you go to this one, the Leader Transition Institute at changing focus registration, either one that will get you there. And if you want to email me, you can do that at admin@leadertransitioninstitute.org. So we have a couple more comments. Oh, wonderful. So the comments are, Val says thank you, and Margie says thank you. That was great info. So really appreciate your time with us tonight. And hopefully we can do another couple of segments through the rest of the year.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, everyone that attended. I know it's Tuesday evening, but yeah, it was my pleasure to help add some value and answer any questions. So my pleasure.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody. See you soon.